The attacks on September 11, 2001 on New York changed the world in just about every manner. The political landscape shifted dramatically, and popular culture was likewise irreversibly altered. The Twin Towers had been an iconic part of the New York skyline for almost 30 years, and there was no way that the arts would remain unaffected by this. There's obviously been movies that directly deal with the attacks themselves, but the impact the tragedy had on cinema itself went deeper, as after 9/11, the entire industry was permanently reshaped. So let's have a chat. I'm Jules for WhatCulture.com, and this is how 9/11 completely changed movies. We begin with a rather obvious effect, that some movies were cancelled outright. Though claims that Jackie Chan was set to be filming in the towers on the day of the attack have been proven false, the film he was making at the time was a high-profile casualty in the aftermath. It was called Nosebleed, and in it he was supposed to play a window cleaner working on the towers who ends up foiling a terrorist plot, which in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy was striking way too close to home, and so it was decided to scrap it rather than looking to rewrite. James Cameron has also revealed that he planned to do a sequel to True Lies, but it was cancelled because he didn't think a comedy about fundamental terrorists was funny anymore. Obviously, some movies that were already in production contained footage of the New York skyline, and as such needed to be edited to reflect this, and scenes that centered around terrorism attacks changed. The Bourne Identity was originally going to lean strongly on a terrorist plot, which was then removed in editing, and even animated films like Lilo and Stitch were altered. Originally, the film was going to end with Stitch hijacking a Boeing 747, but that became an alien ship in the final cut. Another case was that of Spider-Man, whose marketing leaned heavily on the World Trade Center. Posters featuring the towers reflected in Spidey's eyes, and a teaser trailer climaxing with bank robbers escaping in a helicopter getting caught in a web spun between them were floated about but ultimately dropped. However, it did give the scene of the New Yorkers ganging up on the Green Goblin an added sense of poignancy. Even films that had already been released were edited in order to reflect the new state of cinema, and post-9/11 sensitivity was added to media, such as the removal of all traces of the Libyans who Doc stole the plutonium from in Back to the Future when it was broadcast on TVs. Other films have almost been written out of existence. The 1976 King Kong has been relegated to obscurity thanks to its ending seeing Kong climb the Twin Towers instead of the Empire State Building. The Simpsons episode, The People of New York vs. Homer Simpson, was removed from the air for about 5 years, as the Twin Towers feature prominently, although the lack of any really offensive material highlights just how sensitive times they were. As you might expect after a tragedy of this size, a general malaise swept the media. However, in a sort of reactive movement, Hollywood greenlit and produced more and more light-hearted and fantasy productions as a form of pure escapism. The 90s had been dominated by massive, world-threatening action, but now it all felt a little too close to home. There was now no escapism in the likes of Independence Day's destruction of the world's monuments. Instead, the likes of The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Pirates of the Caribbean became big franchises, offering something different to what was on the news. The big releases in 2002 to 2003 are pretty much across the board this sort of family-friendly fare. Controversy would arise every now and again, but for a while the industry went in a very inoffensive direction. However, that's not to say that the event wasn't used in manipulative ways, and I do want to state I don't mean manipulative in a negative fashion, merely that new imagery created by the tragedy began to ripple through cinema as the world came to terms with things. By 2005, it was clear that thoughts were beginning to change, and more shots seemed to present themselves as echoes of the event. Steven Spielberg's The War of the Worlds came out in 2005, and one could argue that visually the film leaned heavily on footage of that day. People walking around dazed past downed planes and destroyed buildings, families cowering as explosions ring out, and, most strikingly, victims coated in dust. The film is not only entering the same territory, but actually invoking the tragedy. Cloverfield took a similar approach, essentially a 9/11 monster movie. Everything about it is built on how the tragedy unfolded. The monster is unexpected and unexplained, throwing the people of New York into terror without them understanding why. Shot from a camcorder, it feels incredibly modern. The shot of the citizens quietly pausing to snap photos of the Statue of Liberty's severed head seems a little silly, but it's pretty on the money. Yet, as you might expect, once the world began to stop reeling from the shock, it began getting angry at the hurt that was caused. And as such, the Middle East became a key setting and terrorists became the go-to bad guys. Films like The Kingdom or The Hurt Locker explored conventional stories in a Middle Eastern setting, but others were seemingly set there for a timely link. Look at Body of Lies, which takes the usual conspiracy story and ports it to Jordan because of relevance. Iron Man, a character who was initially conceived to reflect the political situation of the Cold War, found his origin story transplanted to Afghanistan with an Al-Qaeda-esque terrorist group holding him hostage. In general, terrorists inevitably became the go-to bad guys of choice, just as the Russians had been in the wake of the Cold War, as it allowed the frustrations of a public in mourning to be vented in acts of retribution. So now we end with something a little more subtle, something that would inevitably happen within cinema but was kick-started by the events. And that was the approach of realism to the proceedings. In the 90s, we had gone a bit mad with garish visuals and ideas becoming the norm. While the 2000s had their fair share of weird, it was a realistic undertone that underpinned them all. By that, I mean, look at films like Casino Royale, which showcased a villain that wanted to fund terrorism, or The Dark Knight, that explored destruction of the social norm.
I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
These films carried more weight because they grounded themselves in a very real issue despite being over the top in other areas. It echoed a thought that we didn't need to look to the stars or for crazy threats to invoke powerful messages and fears in our films, because unfortunately, thanks to 9/11, there were very real threats and tragedies that still dominated the collective conscience.